The profound stillness within Jerusalem was widely interpreted as the ultimate profanation. It was not the silence of achieved peace, but the quiet of collective, exhausted apprehension resulting from the city's recent surrender. In the year 1187, the Holy City, the singular objective of the Latin West for 90 years, had officially fallen. Its capture was achieved not through a bloody assault or the utilization of heavy siege weaponry, but through an ignominious capitulation formalized on parchment. This outcome represented not merely a territorial loss, but the reversal of an entire century of zealous Western endeavor. The memory of the 1099 conquest, characterized by the indiscriminate slaughter of the Muslim and Jewish populations, now hung heavy over the defeated Franks, who expected a commensurate retribution. The symbolic weight of the surrender, occurring less than 100 years after the city was first wrenched from the Muslim world, constituted a catastrophic theological and political defeat for all of Christendom, casting doubt upon the protective power of God. In the immediate vicinity of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the remaining Frankish inhabitants observed the hoisting of the new banners. Balian of Ibelin, the taciturn noble who had negotiated the terms of surrender, experienced the heavy emotional burden of failure. His position was not that of a victorious defender, but of a man whose pragmatic decision for mercy over martyrdom now carried a pervasive social stigma. Balian's choice, however, was predicated upon the dire military reality that the city was essentially devoid of fighting men, possessing fewer than 2 able-bodied knights for every 100 citizens. The keys to the citadel, previously in his possession, now belonged to Salah al-Bin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, a figure whose reputation as both a successful conqueror and a principled gentleman would be historically significant. Saladin. The thoroughfares, which only days earlier had been clogged with the desperate cries of a population preparing for widespread slaughter, now presented an image of remarkable order. This organization represented a conceptual shock, a quiet, unsettling antithesis to the Western expectation of brutal reprisal. In contrast to the massacres the Crusaders themselves had perpetuated upon the city a century prior, organized lines of defeated Franks were purchasing their freedom, progressing step by agonizing step. Men, women, and children were required to pay a stipulated ransom of 10, 5, and 1 dinar respectively for the authorization to depart alive. The ransoming process was managed with a cold, administrative efficiency that belied the spiritual significance of the locale. Balian observed an aged priest attempting to negotiate a gold chalice against the exit toll for a widowed mother and her 2 dependents. The Ayyubid soldiers, drawn from Saladin's disciplined professional forces, were relentless yet objective. The requirement was coin or enslavement. Sentimentality was absent. The methodical processing of thousands of individuals underscored the professionalism of the Sultan's army, a stark contrast to the often chaotic and mercenary forces of the Latin states. This enforcement of the established laws of war was executed without emotion, which only intensified the cold nature of the transaction. The dramatic shift occurred when the Sultan himself proceeded through the Gate of David. The sunlight illuminated the gold embroidery on the Ayyubid banner. Saladin was attired not in heavy armor or regal ornamentation, but in simple white linen and a practical tunic. His beard was meticulously maintained, and his deeply set eyes, positioned above prominent cheeks, appeared to assimilate both the city's shame and its glory simultaneously. He projected the bearing of an individual who had anticipated this moment for decades, not with impetuosity, but with the quiet conviction of destiny fulfilled. Saladin's character presented a sharp contrast to the Western kings whose avarice and factional disputes had facilitated his conquest. He was a Kurd and a Sunni Muslim, yet also a skilled scholar of jurisprudence and an astute political strategist. He had successfully unified the fragmented Islamic territories, systematically neutralizing weaker adversaries, such as the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt and the various Zangid principalities, before focusing his formidable military attention on the Crusader states. His decisive victory at the Battle of Hattin months earlier had effectively dismantled the entire military structure of the Latin kingdom, leaving Jerusalem vulnerable and strategically indefensible. "My Lord Balian," Saladin addressed the Frankish nobleman in perfect Greek, a language readily understood by Balian. "You have not yet commenced your departure. I had anticipated your prompt fulfillment of duty." Balian adjusted his worn cloak. "Sultan, I shall remain until the last individual under my protection has successfully departed. That stipulation was integral to our accord." Saladin dismounted with precise and economical movements, entrusting his horse to an attendant rather than a military officer. "The accord is acknowledged. You offered territorial secessions and a selection of chattel. I granted the lives of your population, a payment I submit of considerably greater value." He gestured toward the queue of ransomed families. "The preservation of these people is attributable not to their deity, but to my established sense of honor." It was a quiet yet devastating articulation of the truth. The Christian world had failed in the defense of its most sacred site. It was Saladin who, motivated by profound religious conviction and strategic acumen, had demonstrated greater clemency toward the defeated than the Christian conquerors had historically displayed toward their own predecessors. This display of mercy, however, functioned as a strategic tool, a calculated degradation designed to underscore the moral superiority of the Ayyubid state over the perceived dissipation and rapacity of the Franks. The ransoming process, however, was becoming protracted, stretching the logistical limits of the occupation. Thousands remained within the city walls, incapable of meeting the required fee. Saladin's younger brother, Al-Adil, the chief administrator, strenuously advocated for the strict adherence to the ransom terms, citing the critical necessity of replenishing the royal treasury depleted by years of conflict and recent military campaigns. The release of thousands of potential slaves represented not only a direct loss of revenue, but also the injection of hostile refugees into enemy territories, posing a subtle long-term political risk. Saladin considered the counsel, then slowly rejected it, directing his gaze toward the Dome of the Rock. "The Prophet emphasized generosity over monetary gain, brother," Saladin stated, elevating his voice for the benefit of his assembled troops. "I harbor no desire to sully this triumph with avarice. Those remaining, the impoverished, the elderly, the widows, and the orphans, shall be granted unconditional freedom of passage." A sudden, stunned silence enveloped the square. The few hundred remaining Christians, anticipating certain servitude, expressed profound relief. This singular act of grace, or perhaps masterful political choreography, would disseminate rapidly across Europe, compelling the West to confront a troubling contradiction. Their principal adversary had exhibited greater magnanimity than their own feudal lords. This intelligence was conveyed by the departing populace, including the Patriarch Heraclius and his cardinals. Heraclius, whose personal wealth was vast, had scandalously paid his own considerable ransom while purportedly failing to contribute the wealth of the church to free his most vulnerable flock, a decision that magnified the moral authority Saladin had asserted. The survivors traveled across the Mediterranean, disseminating the single, terrifying message: the cross had fallen, the sepulchre was captive, and only the collective might of Europe's great monarchs could redeem Christendom from this indelible humiliation. The resulting political shockwave across the continent was instantaneous and profound. Pope Urban III, upon receipt of the news, reportedly succumbed to grief and expired within weeks. The subsequent papal mandate for a new, immediate crusade was issued with a fervor unseen since the First Crusade. This call was not predicated on expansion or territorial ambition, but on existential necessity
and the imperative to erase the disgrace represented by Jerusalem's forfeiture. Three rulers, the most powerful sovereigns in Europe, were thus compelled by theological duty, geopolitical pressure, and personal ambition to mobilize. The stage was thereby set up for a confrontation between the merciless forces of medieval realpolitik and the solitary figure, Saladin, who had mastered both military strategy and conditional mercy. These rulers, Richard and Philip II, were thereby compelled to respond, embarking on a course of action that would ultimately result in the physical incarceration of one and the political compromise of the other.
The news of Jerusalem's capitulation traveled across the Alps not merely as a military bulletin, but as a severe indictment of European leadership. While the maritime powers of the Mediterranean received the refugees and the scandalous reports of the Patriarch Heraclius, the true spiritual and temporal authority of the continent resided in the Holy Roman Empire, commanded by Frederick I, known as Barbarossa. His response was awaited with an almost theological urgency. If the emperor, the inheritor of Charlemagne and the putative equal of the Byzantine Basileus, failed to act, the cause of the cross was deemed irrevocably lost. In the spring of 1188, the imperial diet convened at Mainz, the epicenter of Germanic political power. The atmosphere within the Grand Assembly Hall was charged not with typical feudal debate, but with an acute sense of religious and dynastic crisis. Lords, bishops, and princes gathered, their traditional rivalries momentarily suspended by the overwhelming shame of the defeat at Hattin and the subsequent loss of the Holy City. The consensus was undeniable. Only a monumental display of centralized imperial power could hope to challenge the Ayyubid Sultanate. Frederick I, now approaching his 70th year, occupied the central dais. His physical presence, though aged, retained the immense authoritative gravity of an eagle resting before flight, a fitting symbol for a man whose long reign had defined stability and ambition across Central Europe. He was a figure steeped in the legacy of Translatio Imperii, the belief that the Roman Empire had been passed through divine right to the German monarchs. Unlike the younger, often capricious rulers of France and England, Frederick viewed the recovery of Jerusalem not as a personal adventure or a means of political gain, but as a sacred obligation inherent to his imperial title. His decision was not impulsive. It was a deliberate, calculated maneuver to reassert his spiritual preeminence in the West, eclipsing the Plantagenet and Capetian dynasties. When he formally took the cross, his vow was delivered not in the manner of a desperate supplicant seeking penance, but as a decree of restoration. He declared his intention to lead the largest and most disciplined army Europe had marshaled since the First Crusade, an army whose mission was to fulfill the promise of German dominion. The preparations that followed were characterized by meticulous, almost unprecedented logistical planning. Frederick issued the so-called Mainz Edict, a comprehensive legal framework for the mobilization and conduct of the expedition. This edict mandated stringent military discipline, strictly prohibiting the participation of any individual deemed unfit for battle, and setting rigid standards for the purchase and transportation of supplies. It was a conscious effort to avoid the disorganized, predatory behavior that had often plagued the earlier Crusades and often alienated the Byzantine Empire, whose lands the host would necessarily traverse. The sheer scale of the assembled force was staggering. While precise contemporary accounts vary, the host that gathered in Regensburg was certainly formidable, potentially numbering tens of thousands of combatants, supported by an even larger non-combatant apparatus of squires, servants, and chaplains. The logistical requirement of moving this enormous human and animal contingent, including thousands of knights and their horses, across the entire European continent and through the hostile territory of Anatolia, was a challenge that dwarfed any contemporary military endeavor. Frederick secured agreements and treaties with the King of Hungary and, crucially, the Byzantine Emperor Isaac II Angelus, attempting to preemptively manage the political friction that such an invasion of sovereign space would inevitably cause. This overland route was deliberately chosen over the riskier, more expensive sea journey favored by the English and French. Frederick, a man of profound practical experience, believed the discipline of his army and the authority of his office would guarantee safe passage.
His choice also underscored his independence. Unlike Richard and Philip, he refused to be dependent on the Italian maritime republics for transport, reinforcing the autonomous nature of the imperial mandate. As the great host began its march in May 1189, the spectacle inspired both awe and terror across Europe. Banners bearing the imperial eagle and the cross of the Redeemer stretched across the horizon, a glittering wave of steel and faith moving toward the east. This was the final, greatest hope of the Christian world, led by its oldest and most respected temporal ruler. The eagle's omen was seen as universally favorable. The emperor, chosen by God, could not fail. Yet beneath the majestic display of imperial might, structural weaknesses were inherent. The reliance on Byzantine cooperation was tenuous, and the treacherous waterless plains of Anatolia presented logistical demands that no European general had ever successfully mastered. Frederick, operating under almost absolute conviction of his divine right, may have underestimated the sheer physical endurance required for such a protracted campaign. As the column snaked east, bearing the fate of the Latin kingdom upon its shoulders, the stage was set for the tragic intersection of overwhelming European force and the immense and unforgiving geography that separated them from Saladin's well-provisioned armies. The Third Crusade was now fully launched, underpinned by the single, fragile expectation of Frederick Barbarossa's inevitable success.
If the impetus for Frederick Barbarossa's mobilization was the unwavering maintenance of imperial dignity, the commitment of the French and English monarchs to the Third Crusade originated in an altogether more volatile political calculus. The immediate prelude to their vow was not piety but parricide, or at least the deep-seated familial and political betrayal that accelerated the demise of Henry II, the great Plantagenet king. The history shared by Richard, the newly ascended King of England and Duke of Aquitaine, and Philip II Augustus, the ambitious King of France, was not one of camaraderie, but of relentless structural antagonism. Philip II, a monarch whose reputation would eventually be defined by his methodical statecraft and his singular focus on consolidating Capetian authority, was acutely aware that the vast continental holdings of the Plantagenet Empire posed an existential threat to the French crown. Richard, conversely, was the epitome of the flamboyant martial knight king. His political life had been a continuous campaign of rebellion, first against his elder brother, and most recently against his own father. It was during this final decisive rebellion against Henry II that Richard and Philip had forged their necessary toxic alliance, a pact between two scorpions, bound by a shared immediate enemy, but maintaining a reciprocal lethal distrust. The death of Henry II in 1189, hastened by the shock of Richard's betrayal, altered the geopolitical landscape instantly. Richard, now possessing the sprawling Angevin domains, and Philip, eager to reclaim French territories held by the English crown, were now poised for the most destructive conflict yet. However, the papal call for the Third Crusade, backed by the catastrophic reports from the East and the moral authority of the Church, provided an unavoidable, though temporary, détente. To refuse the cross now was to suffer political ruin and spiritual condemnation, a risk neither ruler could afford. The Crusade, therefore, functioned as a mandated politically expedient ceasefire, a temporary redirection of their immense energies and resources. Their solemn taking of the cross was undertaken at Gisors, a location historically symbolic of the Plantagenet-Capetian border disputes, ironically emphasizing the very divisions they were ostensibly swearing to transcend. Richard's motivation was complex, rooted equally in personal piety and an insatiable desire for martial glory. He saw the crusade as the ultimate stage for his military talents, an opportunity to achieve fame that would forever eclipse his forebears. Philip, by contrast, was cold and pragmatic. He was younger than Richard, physically slighter, and possessed none of the Lionheart's impulsive heroism. For Philip, the crusade was a means to an end. It ensured Richard's dangerous absence from his European domains, providing the Capetian king with the critical time required to consolidate his holdings and prepare for the inevitable territorial seizure upon Richard's return. The subsequent planning and mobilization underscored their contrasting temperaments. Richard's preparations were characterized by a magnificent, ruthless efficiency. To finance his campaign, he employed every legal and extra-legal measure available: taxes, forced sales of offices, and the notorious declaration that he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. This financial desperation, however, was channeled into creating the finest military force in Europe. A formidable army, and crucially, a fleet of unprecedented size and quality, designed to avoid the treacherous and politicized overland route that Frederick I had chosen. Philip's preparations were meticulous but understated. He focused on ensuring the seamless governance of his kingdom during his absence, delegating authority to loyal and competent ministers. His ambition was quiet, a steady undercurrent of statecraft, prioritizing stability over spectacle. While Richard busied himself assembling his ships, mercenaries, and a spectacular personal retinue, Philip was strategically cultivating alliances within the Holy Roman Empire, and critically maintaining correspondence with Richard's disillusioned younger brother John. The seeds of future betrayal were sown long before the two kings reached the Mediterranean. The two monarchs finally met in Vézelay in 1190 to consolidate their forces for the march south toward the sea. The sheer magnitude of the combined Anglo-French host signaled a massive commitment of Western resources, vastly superior to the German effort lost in Anatolia. Yet even in this shared encampment, the mutual suspicion was palpable. They agreed to travel and fight side by side, sharing resources and swearing oaths to protect each other's European holdings during the expedition, an oath Philip already intended to violate. The alliance was secured not by genuine fraternity, but by a shared political imperative and the recognition of their mutual military dependency. They were two great powers moving in forced synchronization, each leader watching the other with a vigilant, predatory gaze. Richard was the overwhelming force of nature, a brilliant tactician focused on the immediate glory of Jerusalem, blind to the long-term political ramifications of his prolonged absence. Philip was the calculating engineer, viewing the entire crusade as a costly but necessary mechanism to draw the lion out of his den, leaving the Plantagenet Empire vulnerable to the methodical, slow encroachment of the French crown. The partnership was the very definition of a pact based on convenience, a temporary truce that masked a fundamental, irreconcilable conflict, destined to dissolve violently the moment the walls of Jerusalem were either reached or abandoned.
The spring of 1189 witnessed the full, staggered commitment of the three great powers of the Latin West. Frederick I Barbarossa, relying on the discipline of his massive host, initiated the protracted overland advance. Richard I and Philip II, leveraging their access to naval resources and the wealth of their domains, opted for the more expansive but strategically sound Mediterranean passage. The Crusade, now officially sanctioned and launched, represented an unparalleled concentration of military and financial capital. Yet its ultimate success depended entirely on the continued, coordinated presence of these three disparate and ambitious sovereigns. Frederick's campaign began with tremendous promise, a meticulous military execution that seemed to vindicate his belief in the superiority of German organization. His army, having navigated the politically complex territories of Hungary and the Byzantine Empire, entered Anatolia in 1190. While Byzantine cooperation proved, predictably, to be tenuous and obstructionist, Frederick's sheer force of will and the disciplined conduct of his troops ensured continued progress. The emperor, refusing to be drawn into minor skirmishes or diplomatic slights, maintained a singular focus on the ultimate objective, Jerusalem. The most significant military achievement of the German advance occurred in May 1190 at Iconium, modern Konya, the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. Despite the immense heat, the fatigue of the long march, and repeated harassment from Turkish light cavalry, the German army executed a successful assault on the city. Frederick, demonstrating his continued vigor despite his advanced age, personally led elements of the charge, inspiring his troops to overcome the formidable defenses. The fall of Iconium, a major strategic and symbolic victory, sent shockwaves through the Islamic world, confirming the formidable reputation of the aged emperor and the fighting prowess of his crusaders. It was a victory that decisively cleared the path through Anatolia and offered tangible evidence that the Western forces, unlike the ill-fated Second Crusade, possessed the capacity to reach the Levant intact. For Saladin, receiving intelligence of the fall of Iconium and the approach of Frederick's immense army was profoundly unsettling. The Sultan had accurately gauged the political weakness and mutual antagonism of Richard and Philip, but the sheer size and proven discipline of the imperial host presented a military dilemma that threatened to negate his gains at Hattin. Saladin commenced immediate preparations to meet this force, recognizing Frederick as the most immediate and substantial threat to his consolidation of power. Had Frederick continued, the strategic landscape of the Third Crusade would have been defined by a direct, colossal engagement between the unified German imperial force and the Ayyubid armies. However, the forces of geography and fate intervened with sudden and devastating finality. On June 10, 1190, the entire strategic equilibrium of the crusade fractured. While attempting to cross the Goksu River, then known as the Salef or Kalikadnus in Cilicia, Frederick I Barbarossa drowned. The exact circumstances remain subject to debate. Whether he was thrown from his horse by the swift current, suffered a heart attack due to the cold water, or misjudged the depth while seeking a quicker passage, the outcome was irreversible. The emperor, the most authoritative figure in the Western world, perished not in glorious battle, but in a remote, insignificant river crossing. The immediate consequence of this unforeseen event was catastrophic. The imperials' carefully constructed apparatus of command and control instantly dissolved. The political bonds holding the vast army together were tied entirely to Frederick's personal authority and charisma. Without him, the collective purpose evaporated. The shock was compounded by the demoralization of facing such an ignominious end for their sacred imperial leader. The imperial army, once the vanguard of Christian hope, instantly fragmented. Many German nobles, having fulfilled their vows, returned to Europe to protect their interests, transporting Frederick's body, or what fragments they could preserve, back to the empire. Only a fraction of the original host, led by Frederick's son, Frederick VI, Duke of Swabia, continued the march, arriving in the Levant months later, decimated by disease, desertion, and despair. This residual force, though brave, was a shadow of the army that had left Regensburg. The great German effort, the largest single contingent of the Third Crusade, was neutralized before it could engage the principal enemy. This sudden collapse fundamentally redirected the entire war effort. The onus for the recovery of Jerusalem now fell entirely upon the remaining monarchs, Richard I of England and Philip II of France. They received news of Frederick's death while wintering in Sicily, having wisely decided to postpone their final sea journey to the Levant. The news was met with a complex mixture of official grief and private, calculating relief. On one hand, the loss of Frederick's vast military resource significantly complicated the challenge of defeating Saladin. On the other, the removal of the most senior temporal authority in the crusade eliminated the potential for imperial command rivalry. The field was now clear. The immense shared responsibility for the crusade rested solely upon the shoulders of the two kings whose shared history was defined by manipulative hostility. The tragic drowning of the emperor, a man of profound duty and structure, inadvertently elevated the two youngest, most volatile, and most ambitious rulers to supreme command. This unanticipated power shift guaranteed that the remainder of the Third Crusade would be defined less by unified Christian effort and more by the intense personal antagonism between Richard and Philip, setting the stage for the dramatic conflicts to come. The path to Jerusalem, so decisively opened by Frederick's victory at Iconium, had been catastrophically broken, leaving Richard and Philip as the reluctant, mutually distrustful heirs to Christendom's grandest military enterprise.
The sea journey of Richard and Philip II, though vastly superior in speed and logistics to Frederick's doomed overland march,
was not without its own political and physical travails. Having paused in Sicily and Cyprus, where Richard, in a display of singular ruthlessness and expediency, conquered the island and married Berengaria of Navarre, securing vital supply lines and funding, the English and French fleets finally converged upon the Levant in the spring and summer of 1191. They arrived not to a swift battle, but to the protracted, gruesome stalemate of the Siege of Acre, a coastal city that had consumed the lives and treasure of the Christian world for 2 years. Acre was less a siege and more a vast, disease-ridden encampment trapped between the city's formidable double walls and Saladin's expertly positioned relief army on the surrounding hills. The Christian forces, led largely by Guy of Lusignan, the nominal king of Jerusalem, and lesser German nobles, had been starved, decimated by dysentery, and demoralized by years of fruitless, repetitive combat. The conditions were horrific. The camp, situated on the narrow coastal plain, was a breeding ground for epidemic, the air thick with the stench of unburied dead, rotting refuse, and the incessant buzzing of flies, earning the area the grim appellation, the Coast of Flies. The arrival of the two kings, particularly Richard's dramatic landing, provided an immediate, vital injection of morale, resources, and military professionalism. Richard I, sailing in with his great fleet and the wealth plundered from Cyprus, disembarked with the swagger and authority of a general who expected instantaneous victory. He immediately ordered the construction of new siege engines designed to surpass anything previously attempted and began organizing the shattered remains of the existing army. His presence was kinetic. He was observed personally directing catapult placements and sharing the discomfort of the camp, even while suffering from the debilitating camp fever known as Arnaldia. Philip II, arriving weeks earlier, had been equally active, but far more measured. He initiated work on his own siege machines and, crucially, began navigating the treacherous political waters of the Crusader camp. While Richard commanded through sheer force of personality and martial skill, Philip utilized his talent for calculated political maneuvering. He discreetly cultivated alliances with the French barons and those who resented Richard's imperious command style, laying the groundwork for a future attempt to seize control of the Latin kingdom's political destiny. The immediate and inevitable clash between the two kings did not concern strategy. Both were focused on the decisive capture of Acre, but over the command structure. Richard, leveraging his recent successes and overwhelming personal reputation, openly asserted his dominance. Philip, adhering to the principle of royal equality, demanded that all orders be issued jointly. This dispute transcended mere military rank. It was a fundamental conflict between Richard's dynamic, meritocratic, and often arrogant leadership and Philip's bureaucratic, prideful assertion of his Capetian birthright. They were unable to agree on anything, from the division of the spoils to the assignment of camp guards, forcing a costly dual command that often resulted in conflicting orders and wasted effort. The escalating tension culminated in a highly public and damaging confrontation. Philip, jealous of Richard's almost idolatrous reception by the common soldiers, constantly sought to undermine the English king. When Richard's siege engines achieved a major breach in the walls, Philip insisted on placing his own French banner, the Oriflamme, above the point of success before Richard's standard, asserting a claim of superior honor. Such petty rivalries, conducted in the full view of the exhausted army, eroded the fragile unity the crusade desperately required. Despite this crippling internal division, the concerted effort of the combined forces, the massive stone-throwing capabilities of their new engines, and the renewed vigor of the troops proved too much for the beleaguered garrison inside Acre. The city had been under siege for nearly 2 years, and the arrival of the Western kings sealed its fate. The garrison, isolated and realizing that Saladin's relief efforts could no longer pierce the Crusader lines, offered terms of surrender. The fall of Acre was achieved through a sustained, overwhelming final assault, forcing the garrison to capitulate in July 1191. It was the first major Christian victory of the Third Crusade, a moment of profound relief and triumph. However, the subsequent events,
The negotiations, the disputes over the command of the captured city, and the division of the immense ransom promised by the Muslims would only intensify the rift between Richard and Philip, propelling their mutual antagonism toward its breaking point and setting the stage for the true crisis of the war. Acre was won, but the cost, in terms of unity and political goodwill, was already proving fatal to the long-term objective of the crusade.
For Saladin, the siege of Acre had transformed from a manageable military engagement into a profound test of personal and political endurance. From his entrenched position in the hills overlooking the coastal plain, the Sultan had been compelled to watch the arrival of the English and French forces, an influx of wealth, manpower, and siege technology that fundamentally altered the balance of power. The initial long stalemate, characterized by disease and low morale among the Christian ranks, had been his strategic advantage. Now, with the dramatic presence of Richard and Philip, that advantage was swiftly dissolving. The Sultan's primary challenge was no longer the Frankish military, but the structural integrity of his own grand, yet fragile coalition. Saladin's empire was a patchwork forged through conquest and diplomacy, requiring continuous, delicate balancing of the ambitions of powerful emirs or local warlords. These leaders, primarily drawn from the Zangid and Ayyubid families, were united by Saladin's charisma and the singular goal of reclaiming Jerusalem, but their loyalty was always conditional and often short-sighted. As the siege dragged on, internal dissent grew sharp and immediate. Many emirs, particularly those whose territories were far from the coast, questioned the wisdom of committing vast, irreplaceable resources to a single, static defense. They criticized Saladin's defensive strategy, arguing that his reluctance to risk a decisive, all-out battle against the combined Crusader forces, even before Richard's arrival, suggested a failure of nerve. They whispered that the Sultan, despite his piety, was losing the divine mandate. The continuous barrage from the newly arrived French and English siege engines, which ripped open the formidable walls of Acre, only amplified these internal pressures. Saladin faced direct, organized betrayal. His generals often failed to commit their forces with the necessary vigor during attempts to break the siege lines, sometimes withholding cavalry or supplies. The emirs understood that the death of Saladin, while regrettable, would instantly dissolve the coalition and allow them to return to their local power bases. Maintaining their collective fealty required a constant, exhausting stream of political favors, exhortations to piety, and, critically, shared success. The Sultan met this crisis not with rash military action, but with his hallmark iron discipline and administrative mastery. He personally circulated among his troops, inspecting the lines, sharing meager rations, and delivering powerful speeches that framed the defense of Acre not as a military strategy, but as a spiritual imperative, a jihad. He invoked the memory of Jerusalem's liberation, reminding his troops that the Franks sought not only to retake the city, but to destroy the Ayyubid unity that had achieved the initial triumph. Crucially, Saladin committed to a scorched earth defense. He ordered the systematic destruction of crops and infrastructure surrounding Acre and the coastal strip. This was a calculated, brutal strategy designed to starve out the vast Crusader camp, which heavily relied on coastal supply lines and local foraging. Acre itself had to be held because of its immense psychological importance. If the coastal fortress fell, the Crusaders would gain an invaluable supply port, allowing them to consolidate their power and launch an immediate, sustained offensive inland toward Jerusalem. Saladin knew that conceding Acre meant losing the war of attrition. His relentless will ultimately contained the betrayal. The Sultan's ability to remain calm and focused under the most extreme pressure, even when the walls of Acre were crumbling and his garrison was starving, served as a stabilizing force for the entire Islamic army. He personally ensured that communication lines remained open and that the small, desperate sallies by his garrison were supported with overwhelming, though ultimately insufficient, counterattacks. He held his position
forcing the Crusaders to pay for every inch of ground in blood and gold, believing that the internal feuding and logistical strain of the Western alliance would eventually achieve what his sword could not. When the Acre garrison finally capitulated in July 1191, Saladin was devastated but not broken. The loss was a bitter public humiliation, immediately validating the criticisms of the dissenting emirs. Yet the Sultan swiftly executed a controlled withdrawal, refusing to allow the emotional shock of the defeat to turn into a rout. He strategically positioned his army to block any immediate push inland, abandoning the immediate area but ensuring that the Crusaders had gained only the city, not the initiative. The stage was now set for the next phase of the campaign, the mobile, open-field conflict, where Saladin's mastery of light cavalry and desert warfare would finally confront Richard's brilliant, heavy-handed generalship. The Sultan's iron will had bent, but it had not shattered, guaranteeing the war would continue with increased ferocity.
The capitulation of Acre in July 1191 should have served as the singular moment of Christian unity and triumph. Instead, the immediate aftermath devolved into an episode of catastrophic cruelty and political infighting that permanently poisoned the relationship between Richard and Philip. The terms of surrender, negotiated hastily by the starving Muslim garrison, included a vast ransom of 200,000 gold dinars, the return of the True Cross, captured at Hattin, and the release of 1,500 Frankish prisoners of war. The entire agreement was guaranteed by the lives of the surrendered garrison held captive by the victorious Crusaders. The division of the spoils immediately reignited the intense latent rivalry between the English and French monarchs. Philip, having arrived first and having exerted significant effort in the siege, demanded equal shares of the city, the prisoners, and the expected ransom. Richard, whose immense personal wealth, naval power, and superior siege engines had ultimately forced the surrender, viewed Philip's claim as both opportunistic and insulting. The ensuing disputes over the allocation of quarters within the city and the custody of key hostages were public, acrimonious, and damaging to the morale of the combined forces. The crucial issue became the ransom deadline. Saladin, still regrouping his forces and negotiating the exact delivery logistics, was unable to meet the specific date stipulated by the Crusaders. His diplomats attempted to broker an extension and secure partial payments, but Richard, impatient, mistrustful, and financially desperate, rejected all delays. For Richard, the siege had been ruinously expensive, and the prospect of the agreed-upon gold and the retrieval of the True Cross was essential for the continuation of the entire war effort. The tension reached its terrifying zenith on August 20, 1191. Richard, citing Saladin's failure to adhere to the precise terms of the agreement, made a decision of singular, devastating brutality. He ordered the execution of the nearly 2,700 members of the captured Muslim garrison. This act, carried out on a small plain outside the city walls in full view of the distant Ayyubid lines, was not a spontaneous outburst of bloodlust, but a calculated, terrorizing demonstration of Richard's authority and his absolute intolerance for logistical failure. It was the Lionheart's grim price for the failure to pay. The subsequent massacre was systematic and comprehensive. The prisoners were marched out and summarily executed by the Crusader forces, an event that instantly terminated any lingering goodwill established by Saladin's mercy at Jerusalem. The intentional, large-scale killing of prisoners who had surrendered under specific terms was a profound breach of medieval military convention and sent a clear, chilling message to Saladin. Richard was a force of uncompromising ferocity, willing to violate the unspoken rules of warfare to achieve his aims. The consequences of this action were instantaneous and far-reaching. For Saladin, the massacre was an intolerable betrayal of honor. It erased any notion of future clemency towards the Franks and immediately hardened his resolve, transforming the war into a grim personal vendetta. He subsequently ordered the execution of the Frankish prisoners he held in retaliation. The blood price was paid, dramatically escalating the moral and military stakes of the entire conflict. Within the Christian camp, the reaction was polarized. While many soldiers saw the massacre as a necessary, if harsh assertion of dominance, Philip II seized upon the cruelty as a moral and political weapon against Richard. Philip, ever the pragmatist, was horrified less by the brutality and more by the immense waste of valuable chattel. The slain men were now worthless as ransoms or slaves. Furthermore, the act provided him with a convenient pretext to further distance himself from his rival's authority. Worse still, for Richard, the tension between the monarchs culminated in Philip's announcement that he would be abandoning the crusade. Plagued by illness, likely the same camp fever that afflicted Richard, but motivated primarily by the ambition to exploit Richard's absence, Philip asserted that his crusader vow had been fulfilled by the capture of Acre. He declared his intention to return to France, leaving his French troops under the command of Hugh III, Duke of Burgundy. This was a direct, devastating political blow to Richard. Philip formally swore a solemn oath before the assembled nobles that he would not attack the Plantagenet domains in Richard's absence, an oath that virtually every observer knew he had no intention of keeping. The political scorpions, having fought side by side to take the wall, were now poised to strike at each other's backs. Richard was left as the sole, exhausted, but undisputed commander of the remaining Third Crusade. The departure of Philip II, Augustus, from the Levant in August 1191 marked the effective end of the co-led Third Crusade and the beginning of a sustained, calculated political betrayal. While Philip's asserted reason for leaving was twofold, a debilitating illness contracted in the pestilent siege of Acre, coupled with the fulfillment of his crusader vow upon the city's capture, his true motivation was purely geopolitical. His absence was strategic. His return to France was essential for the systematic dismantling of the Angevin Empire, while its colossal military engine, Richard I, was thousands of miles away. The manner of Philip's retreat was characterized by petty indignation and veiled malice. He flatly refused Richard's demand that he remain in the Holy Land, or, failing that he leave half of the French treasure and troops for the continuation of the campaign. Philip departed with a large contingent of his knights and all his accumulated wealth, leaving only a token force under the Duke of Burgundy, Hugh III, whose loyalty to the French crown was conditional and often obstructive to Richard's command. The journey back was swift and purposeful. Philip landed in Italy and proceeded overland, his mind focused entirely on the territorial vulnerabilities of the Plantagenet domains, Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. The solemn oath he had sworn before the nobles at Acre to abstain from any attack on Richard's lands during his absence was regarded by the calculating Capetian monarch as a temporary political necessity, not a binding constraint. Within weeks of setting foot on French soil, Philip began the quiet mobilization of his resources for war. The primary target of Philip's machinations was not open warfare, which would violate his oath too flagrantly, but the manipulation of Richard's internal family enemies. His chief collaborator became Prince John, Richard's younger brother, a figure defined by his immense ambition and notable lack of scruple. John, already governing England with the degree of authority that bordered on autonomy, viewed Richard's prolonged absence as an opportunity to usurp the English throne. Immediately, Philip opened clandestine correspondence with John, offering a mutual understanding that would effectively sanction John's usurpation in exchange for significant territorial concessions on the continent, particularly the strategically vital Vexin region and parts of Normandy. This collusion was the essence of the viper slithers home, a cold, subtle poisoning of the political landscape designed to destroy Richard's empire from within. John, convinced of Richard's potential death or indefinite detainment in the East, embraced the French king's offer. Simultaneously, Philip directed diplomatic pressure against Richard's remaining continental vassals, sowing seeds of discontent and offering French protection to those who felt alienated by the Lionheart's heavy-handed fundraising methods prior to the Crusade. He skillfully exploited the regional loyalties and the lingering resentment against the centralized authority of the Plantagenet dynasty. Every diplomatic overture, Every promise of security was a calculated chipping away at the foundations of Richard's power base. This cynical shift in focus fundamentally altered the nature of the war in the East. By returning, Philip effectively transferred the principal conflict from the deserts of the Levant back to the feudal heartland of Europe. Richard, despite his military genius, was now fighting a two-front war, a physical campaign against Saladin and an existential defense of his homeland against the predatory schemes of his former ally and his own treacherous brother. The realization that Philip was aggressively moving against him would not reach Richard immediately, but the French king's betrayal cast a long, cold shadow over the remainder of the crusade. Philip's departure left Richard as the undisputed military leader, which suited his temperament, but simultaneously shackled him with the entire burden of logistics, strategy, and political maintenance. The necessity of eventually returning to defend his threatened dominions began to impose a severe time constraint on Richard's campaign against Saladin. The seeds of the Crusade's ultimate failure, the inability to recover and hold Jerusalem, were sown not on the battlefield, but in the calculating mind of Philip II, who understood that political opportunity, not piety, was the ultimate prize of the entire endeavor. He had secured his advantage, and the stage was now set for Richard, stripped of his ally, to lead the Christian remnant toward the inevitable final confrontation.
With the calculating departure of Philip II, Richard I was finally free of the debilitating political constraints of dual command. The French king's betrayal, while strategically damaging to the Angevin realm, paradoxically unleashed the full unbridled force of Richard's military genius in the East. Stripped of his rival, the Lionheart now stood as the undisputed leader of the remaining Christian forces, galvanized by the knowledge that only a decisive victory against Saladin could secure his legacy and, eventually, his throne. The goal remained fixed, Jerusalem. But the path was perilous, dominated by Saladin's regrouped and vengeful armies. Richard recognized that holding Acre was insufficient. To launch a successful assault on the Holy City, the Crusaders required a secure, fully operational coastal base of operations further south. The key to this objective was Jaffa, the principal port protecting Jerusalem. The campaign thus commenced with a grueling forced march south from Acre, an endeavor that required not just strength but unprecedented discipline and tactical innovation in the face of continuous harassment. The march began in late August 1191. Richard implemented a command structure that reflected his deep understanding of combined arms and logistical necessity. He organized the army into 12 rigid parallel columns, 6 French and 6 English, maintaining perfect marching order. The entire force moved in lockstep, flanked on the seaward side by the English fleet, which provided essential supplies and protected the flank. This reliance on the fleet solved the primary logistical problem that had defeated Frederick Barbarossa, securing food and water in the arid coastal plain. However, the inland flank was exposed to the relentless pressure of Saladin's forces. The Sultan, having absorbed the lesson of Richard's brutality at Acre, was determined to destroy the Crusader army through attrition rather than direct engagement. His Mamluk and Bedouin cavalry employed ceaseless skirmishes and harassment tactics, striking quickly at the flanks and rear, avoiding heavy contact, and attempting to break the cohesion of the march. The goal was simple: exhaust the heavy Crusader infantry, deplete their horses, and seize control of any potential water sources. Richard's counter-strategy was revolutionary and brutal in its efficacy. He mandated absolute, inflexible discipline among his troops. No knight or foot soldier was permitted to break rank to pursue the light, fast-moving Turkish archers, regardless of provocation. The army was essentially transformed into a moving fortress. The infantry marched on the exposed side, locking their shields to absorb the arrows, while the armored knights moved between the infantry and the coast, prepared for an immediate localized countercharge. This discipline was enforced by the threat of immediate execution, a necessity Richard imposed to maintain momentum. Despite these measures, the conditions were appalling. The heat was immense, water was scarce, and the constant stress of the Turkish attacks tested the endurance of every man. The desert road became a gauntlet of suffering. Soldiers marched in the metallic glare, their armor absorbing the heat, while their horses, critical for the decisive charge, began to falter.
The only thing preventing a rout was the singular, inspiring presence of Richard. The Lionheart was constantly in motion, moving up and down the lines, organizing the vanguard, or personally commanding the rear guard against the fiercest attacks. His courage was not just symbolic, it was tactical. He was seen everywhere, his voice, deep and commanding, cutting through the clamor of battle, directing movements, and stabilizing sections of the line that wavered under heavy arrow fire. This visibility and active engagement cemented his legendary status among his own troops, transforming weary soldiers into a dedicated fighting machine. The ultimate objective of this arduous journey was not just Jaffa, but forcing Saladin into a pitched battle on terms favorable to the Crusaders. Saladin, recognizing the impossibility of stopping the methodical progress of the Christian columns through skirmishes alone, reluctantly prepared his full army for a decisive confrontation. Richard's relentless march was working. He was pushing the Sultan onto ground where the heavy cavalry, which had been the deciding factor in every major Crusader victory, could finally be deployed with devastating effect. The coastal plain itself had been turned into a lethal mobile chessboard, controlled by the relentless will of the English king, pushing ever closer to the location where the final reckoning would inevitably occur. The lion was on the march, and Saladin was compelled to meet him.
The relentless, disciplined march of Richard's army had, by September 7, 1191, achieved its strategic objective, forcing Saladin to engage in open combat on the narrow coastal plain north of Jaffa, near the wood of Arsuf. The Sultan could no longer afford to allow the Crusaders to seize the vital port of Jaffa unchallenged. This engagement, unlike the chaotic skirmishes of the preceding weeks, would be a set-piece battle, a monumental clash between the two finest commanders of the age, each deploying strategies tailored to the absolute strengths of their respective forces. Saladin's plan was attrition, aiming to destroy the Crusader cohesion before the heavy Christian cavalry could launch its devastating charge. He positioned his army, a formidable coalition of Egyptian, Syrian, and Mesopotamian troops, including his elite Mamluk cavalry, in a broad crescent, waiting for the Crusader column to emerge from the forested area of Arsuf. His tactic was a continuous, staggered assault designed to draw the Crusaders out of their defensive formation. Waves of skirmishers, primarily Turkish horse archers, hammered the Christian line with a constant barrage of arrows and javelins, targeting the unprotected horses and the exposed infantry. Richard's counter-strategy was one of calculated, agonizing patience. He had organized his army with meticulous precision, the Knights Templar and Hospitallers in the van and rear, the French under Hugh of Burgundy in the center, and the English and Norman infantry forming the iron spine. The Christian army was ordered to advance slowly, maintaining the shield wall formation that had proven effective during the march. The mandate was absolute. The cavalry was forbidden to charge until Richard, personally commanding the reserve, gave the signal, which would be 3 blasts on the trumpets. For hours, the Crusader infantry endured the immense pressure. Saladin's archers closed to dangerously short ranges, emptying quivers into the unyielding European ranks. The pain was immense, and the strategic tension was almost unbearable. The Hospitallers, forming the rear guard, the most exposed and harassed section of the line, suffered appalling casualties. Their Grand Master repeatedly implored Richard for the charge command, but the Lionheart, cold and focused, refused, understanding that a premature charge would break the formation and expose the entire army to encirclement and piecemeal destruction, replicating the disaster of Hattin. The breaking point arrived not from Richard's will, but from the desperation of the Hospitallers. 2 leading knights, unable to bear the slaughter of their horses and men any longer, spontaneously broke rank and charged into the dense ranks of the Ayyubid skirmishers. This small, unauthorized breach in discipline threatened to unravel the entire plan. Seeing the movement, the rest of the Hospitallers' knights, followed by the English and Norman contingents, were forced to commit, turning the unauthorized charge into a massed defensive counterattack. Richard, recognizing that the delicate moment of tactical control had passed, instantly adapted. Instead of attempting to recall the charging units, a move that would invite disaster, he galloped forward, shouting for the trumpets to sound the plan's signal. The 3 blasts resonated across the coastal plain, releasing the pent-up ferocity of the entire Crusader heavy cavalry. The resulting charge was devastating. The heavily armored lance-wielding knights, conserved and disciplined throughout the long march, hit the exposed, exhausted ranks of Saladin's cavalry with tremendous force.
The Ayyubid horsemen, experts at harassment and fluid maneuver, but unable to withstand a concentrated shock assault, were broken. Richard himself led the countercharge, his personal involvement a galvanizing force. Witnesses attested to his terrifying effectiveness in combat, cutting down every man who came within his reach. The Battle of Arsuf was a decisive tactical victory for the Crusaders. Saladin's army, though not destroyed, was forced to flee the field in disarray, sustaining heavy losses and, more significantly, suffering a profound psychological defeat. Richard had proven that the Crusaders, when disciplined and properly led, could defeat the unified Ayyubid field army. The victory secured the coastal plain, cleared the road to Jaffa, which the Crusaders occupied immediately after, and restored the military reputation of the Latin West, which had been severely compromised since Hattin. However, the victory was achieved at a terrible cost, both personal and strategic. Richard's decision to risk his entire force through an agonizing delay, forcing his men to endure intense suffering, emphasized his single-minded cruelty in pursuit of victory. Furthermore, while the victory was decisive, it was not terminal. Saladin, the master of withdrawal, refused to commit his entire reserve, preserving the core of his army. The Sultan learned a crucial lesson at Arsuf, never again to risk a pitched battle against Richard's heavy cavalry. The path to Jerusalem was now open, but the final, most complex conflict, the siege itself, still lay ahead, with Saladin prepared to adapt his strategy to meet the terrifying genius of the Lionheart.
The immediate consequence of the victory at Arsuf was the swift occupation of Jaffa, securing the vital port required for the logistical support of a prolonged campaign. With the coastal plain firmly in Christian hands, Richard I was poised to achieve the objective that had eluded all European rulers since 1187, the recovery of Jerusalem. The path inland was open, but the physical distance of 30 miles concealed a chasm of strategic complexity that would test the Lionheart's brilliance more severely than any field battle. The push inland began in the late autumn of 1191. As the Crusaders left the reliable supply line of the sea and ascended into the Judean hills, the tactical advantages shifted decisively back to Saladin. The terrain became rugged, defiles were easily ambushed, and water sources were increasingly rare and often poisoned or rendered inaccessible by the Sultan's retreating forces. Saladin, having learned the lesson of Arsuf, refused to commit to another direct engagement. His strategy transformed into one of denial, denying the Crusaders food, water, rest, and critically, the logistical means to conduct a successful siege. Richard's advance was relentless yet deeply troubled. The army was continually battered by Saladin's light cavalry, which harassed the supply lines and picked off stragglers. The constant rain and the mud of the winter approach compounded the misery, rotting the vital foodstuffs and eroding the morale of the European soldiers, who were psychologically exhausted after years of campaigning. Richard's genius, however, ensured that the advance continued. He pushed the army forward using his personal dynamism and the deployment of advanced scouting techniques, demonstrating immense fortitude. The culmination of this arduous, frustrating march occurred in January 1192. After weeks of punishing ascent, Richard, accompanied by a small retinue of his most trusted commanders, crested a ridge near Beit Nuba. The heavy, low-hanging rain clouds parted momentarily, revealing the singular objective, starkly visible against the horizon: Jerusalem. The site of the city, its walls, domes, and spires, the goal of their immense sacrifices, was a moment of profound, agonizing revelation. Yet Richard himself, despite his warrior's heart, refused to look upon it. Historical accounts suggest he raised his shield before his eyes, declaring that he was unworthy to look upon the city if he could not save it. This was not humility, but the recognition of an impossible military reality. Richard's personal denial symbolized the overwhelming logistical and strategic impasse. His generals presented the cold, objective analysis. The army, though victorious at Arsuf, was too weak and too ill-equipped to successfully assault and hold Jerusalem. First, a siege would require immense quantities of timber for siege engines, which was unavailable in the rocky Judean landscape. Second, Saladin's strategy of denial had worked. The Crusaders' supply lines, stretching tenuously back to Jaffa, were vulnerable to being cut, and the army would starve while attempting the siege. Third, even if Jerusalem fell, holding it was impossible. Saladin's relief forces were immense and could easily cut off the small Christian garrison once the main Crusader army returned to the coast for supplies. Richard, the most brilliant military mind on the field, was forced to concede the terrifying logic of the situation. To attack Jerusalem now would not be a victory, but a catastrophic replay of Hattin, trapping his army inland and annihilating the remainder of the crusade. The Lionheart was faced with the deepest crisis of his campaign, choosing strategic necessity over spiritual ambition. He ordered the humiliating, agonizing retreat back down the hills toward the safety and supplies of the coast. This retreat, conducted under the watchful and aggressive eyes of Saladin's forces, was almost as difficult as the advance. The decision to turn back, driven by pragmatism, but perceived by many common soldiers as a crisis of faith, caused a profound dip in morale and a renewed surge of political discontent, particularly among the French contingents. For Richard, the retreat was a personal failure, forcing him to acknowledge the physical limitations of his European resources against the strategic mastery of Saladin and the unforgiving reality of the desert environment. He had seen the prize, and by not choosing to grasp it, he was implicitly accepting that the terms of the war must fundamentally change from conquest to negotiation. The ultimate cost of Philip's betrayal, forcing Richard to rush his campaign, had now manifested in the abandonment of the Crusades' sacred goal. The humiliating withdrawal from the gates of Jerusalem confirmed a strategic deadlock. Richard I possessed the overwhelming tactical advantage in open battle, as proven at Arsuf, but Saladin held the logistical advantage of interior lines, time, and command of the crucial inland resources. Neither leader could destroy the other, and neither could achieve their ultimate objective unilaterally. For Richard, the immediate reality was compounded by the increasingly dire intelligence arriving from Europe, detailing the aggressive betrayal by Philip II and the opportunism of his own brother, Prince John. The political necessity of defending his homeland now severely constrained the time he could afford to spend in the Levant. Richard's response to this mounting pressure was twofold: a renewed, desperate flurry of military activity and a simultaneous initiation of final negotiations. The military effort began with a second, audacious push toward Jerusalem in the summer of 1192, following a period of consolidation in Jaffa. This time, Richard led his army even closer to the Holy City, repairing castles and securing supply routes in an attempt to make the siege logistically feasible. However, Saladin, anticipating this move, launched a sudden, massive counterattack on Jaffa itself, hoping to destroy Richard's base while the main army was in the hills. The Sultan's surprise assault succeeded in retaking the port city, trapping a small Crusader garrison in the citadel. Richard's reaction was immediate and defining. He raced back from the hills and, in what became his final and most legendary action in the east, led a small force in a heroic, successful recapture of the city. The Battle of Jaffa in August 1192 was a staggering exhibition of Richard's personal valor and tactical brilliance, culminating in the famous scene where he, nearly alone on the beach, held off waves of Mamluk soldiers. The victory was total, but it was also the final exhausted gasp of the Crusader war effort. Richard himself was physically depleted, and his forces were severely diminished. The sheer effort required to hold the coastal strip confirmed the impossibility of a sustained inland campaign. With both armies exhausted, the war entered its final, inevitable phase: diplomacy. Negotiations between Richard and Saladin had occurred sporadically throughout the crusade, often involving bizarre exchanges of gifts, including Richard offering his sister Joan as a bride for Saladin's brother Al-Adil, with Jerusalem as the wedding gift. But these were mostly political theater. Now the talks were grimly serious, dictated by mutual necessity. The negotiators were primarily Al-Adil, representing Saladin, and Hubert Walter, Bishop of Salisbury, representing Richard. The discussions were characterized by mutual respect, but inflexible terms. Saladin was a gentleman, profoundly respectful of Richard's courage and skill, but he was absolutely immovable on the central demand: Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control. He argued that the city was as sacred to Muslims as it was to Christians, and surrendering it after its liberation would be a betrayal of the entire Islamic world. Richard reluctantly conceded. He knew he could not take the city, and even if he did, he could not stay to defend it against Philip's mounting threat in Europe. The terms of the final settlement, the Treaty of Jaffa, were the bitter exchange for which the entire crusade had been fought. Territorial status quo. The Christian kingdom would be confined to the coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa, and inland regions would revert to Saladin. Access to Jerusalem. Unarmed Christian pilgrims would be granted safe passage and free access to Jerusalem's holy sites for 3 years. Duration. The truce was set for 3 years, 8 months, and 8 days. The signing of the treaty in September 1192 was the true, painful climax of the Third Crusade. Richard had failed in the objective of his vow, but he had secured the military survival of the remaining Crusader states and guaranteed Christian access to the Holy City, a pragmatic victory carved from catastrophic failure. He achieved the best possible outcome under impossible constraints. The departure of Richard I from the Levant shortly thereafter was subdued. He left not in triumph, but in the knowledge that his glory was limited to the battlefield. The Lionheart had faced the greatest Muslim ruler of his time and held him to a stalemate, but the cruelty of kings was a force more dangerous than the Ayyubid armies. Richard was sailing home to face the betrayal of Philip II, and enemies whose cruelty was expressed not in the heat of battle, but in the cold calculation of European realpolitik. He left the Holy Land with the understanding that his fight for his own throne had only just begun.
The departure of Richard I from the port of Acre in October 1192 marked the end of the Third Crusade's active military phase and ushered in an era of precarious truce. Richard's primary objective was no longer Jerusalem, but the defense of his continental empire and the punishment of Philip II, compelling him to choose a treacherous northern route home to avoid French-controlled territories. He left the Christian presence in the Levant stabilized, but severely reduced, trusting that the Treaty of Jaffa, born of necessity, would hold. The immediate consequence of the truce was an uneasy quiet. Saladin, the great unifier of the Islamic world, had emerged militarily victorious, yet deeply exhausted. He had retained Jerusalem and checked the might of the 3 greatest European monarchs, but the cost to his empire, both in financial resources and the fatigue of his armies, was immense. The final irony of the campaign was that neither the brilliant English lion nor the steadfast Muslim sultan would survive long to see the truce expire. Barely 6 months after the treaty was signed, in March 1193, Saladin succumbed to a fever in Damascus. His death was a catastrophic event for the Ayyubid world, instantly fulfilling the long-held fears of his emirs. The fragile coalition, bound only by Saladin's iron will and personal charisma, immediately fragmented. His vast territories were divided among his sons and his ambitious brother Al-Adil, initiating a period of internecine conflict that ensured the Ayyubids would be incapable of launching a unified, decisive offensive against the remaining Crusader states for decades. Saladin's most enduring legacy was not the conquest of Jerusalem, which he had preserved,
but the demonstration that a unified Islamic front could defeat the Crusader West, a lesson that his successors, though fragmented, would not forget. The Treaty of Jaffa therefore became the unexpected foundation for the continued existence of the Crusader states. Richard's pragmatic choice to prioritize access over possession secured a viable, defensible coastal strip and, crucially, granted European pilgrims the right to visit the Holy Sepulchre. This provision satisfied the minimum spiritual demand of the West, cooling the immediate fervor for another massive crusade. The treaty recognized a permanent, if often hostile, coexistence between the two faiths in the region, establishing an uneasy geopolitical equilibrium that would define the next century of conflict. For Richard, the legacy of the crusade was a mixture of unparalleled glory and profound personal misfortune. He had earned the reputation as the most formidable warrior king of the Middle Ages, a legend cemented by his tactical brilliance at Arsuf and his personal courage at Jaffa. Yet, the same pragmatic route that allowed him to exit the Holy Land led directly to his disastrous capture in Austria by Duke Leopold V, an enemy Richard had insulted during the siege of Acre. This political misstep, resulting from a failure to anticipate the deep resentments he had cultivated in Europe, transformed Richard from the savior of Christendom into a political pawn. His subsequent incarceration, which lasted over a year and required a crippling ransom, money that ironically should have been used to fight Saladin, provided the perfect window of opportunity for Philip II, the Viper. Slithering home utilized Richard's imprisonment to maximum effect, consolidating his hold over key Plantagenet strongholds and forming an open, damaging alliance with Prince John. The true measure of Richard's failure in the Third Crusade was not his inability to take Jerusalem, but his strategic miscalculation regarding the threat posed by his European rival. The ultimate legacy of the Third Crusade was thus defined by the contrasting cruelties of the three great kings: Frederick's impersonal cruelty of logistical fate, Richard's necessary tactical cruelty on the battlefield, and Philip's cold, enduring cruelty of political ambition. The Holy City remained in Muslim hands, but the Crusade had demonstrated that the conflict in the Levant was no longer a matter of faith alone, but a complex geopolitical struggle whose fate would be decided as much by events in Paris and London as on the plains of Palestine. Richard's fight for his crown, initiated by Philip's betrayal, would now dominate European politics, completing the tragic cycle of the Crusades as a means to achieve personal, secular power.
Richard I's flight from the Levant was characterized by desperate speed and profound strategic miscalculation. Aware that the sea lanes and coasts of France were controlled by agents of Philip II, the English king opted for a hazardous and secretive journey overland through the heart of Central Europe. His plan was to traverse the Adriatic, travel through the Germanic lands, and reach the safe harbor of England or his allied territories. This choice, however, forced him into the domains of enemies he had personally and publicly slighted during the Crusade, most notably Duke Leopold V of Austria and the powerful Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI. Leopold harbored a burning, public grievance stemming from the siege of Acre, where Richard had allegedly insulted the Duke's banner by having it torn down from the conquered city walls, a profound affront to the honor of the German nobility. This insult was unforgivable. Richard, traveling in the disguise of a humble merchant or pilgrim, severely underestimated the reach of these deeply rooted political and personal animosities. The perilous journey across the Adriatic was complicated by storms, and Richard was forced ashore near Aquileia, from which point the small traveling party began its arduous overland trek. The disguise was thin, his bearing too noble, and his expenditures too generous to maintain the illusion of common anonymity. After weeks of avoiding detection, the inevitable occurred in December 1192. Exhausted and ill, the party stopped to rest in an inn just outside Vienna, near the village of Erdberg. Richard's expensive ring, or perhaps the excessive payment for a meal, betrayed his identity to the Duke's agents. The final critical error was the retention of his young page, who was recognized as an attendant of the English court.
Duke Leopold V, alerted to the presence of his great enemy, swiftly mobilized his men and captured the English king without conflict. The Lionheart, the greatest warrior of Christendom and the undisputed commander of the recent crusade, was seized not by a noble adversary in battle, but by a minor duke in the dead of a bleak winter night. The shame of the capture was immediate and total. Richard was initially held under harsh imprisonment in Dürnstein Castle. The news of the capture, traveling initially as rumor and then as verifiable fact, created an instantaneous political earthquake across Europe. Philip II, already poised for aggression, received the intelligence with undisguised elation. The most dangerous man in the West was not merely absent, he was physically removed, a prisoner of a third party, and utterly vulnerable. The opportunity that Philip had cynically maneuvered for had arrived years sooner and with a far greater certainty than he could have ever engineered himself. Philip's reaction was one of cold, aggressive opportunism. He immediately entered into open correspondence with Prince John, formalizing the alliance that had been brewing in secret since Philip's return. He offered John the crown of England and the remaining continental holdings of the Plantagenet Empire, in exchange for vast sums of gold and the immediate surrender of strategic territories, including the coveted Vexin region, a crucial borderland between Normandy and French royal lands. The alliance moved with ruthless speed. While Richard endured captivity, stripped of his crown and his freedom, Philip and John launched a combined military and diplomatic assault on the Angevin Empire. Philip systematically invaded and captured several key Norman castles, using the legal pretext that the English king had violated his feudal duties. Simultaneously, John seized the royal treasury and attempted to consolidate support in England, proclaiming Richard dead or permanently incapacitated. The two collaborators, the Viper and the Traitor, acted in perfect predatory synchronization, attempting to dismantle the Plantagenet dynasty piece by piece. The imprisonment of Richard I thus transformed the final phase of the Crusades into a war of survival for the English throne itself. The man who had faced down Saladin's legions now found his greatest challenge was not military, but political. A devastating betrayal carried out not on the battlefields of the Levant, but in the cold calculation of the European courts, fueled by the unexpected vulnerability of his capture in the snow.
Richard I's imprisonment, orchestrated by the combination of Duke Leopold V and Emperor Henry VI, quickly became one of the greatest financial and political scandals of the medieval period. Philip II of France, informed of the high-value captive, immediately began negotiations with the emperor, offering immense sums of money, an alliance of unprecedented greed, to either keep Richard incarcerated indefinitely or, failing that, to have him delivered directly into Capetian custody. Philip's ambition had reached its zenith, the elimination of his rival without having to risk a direct military engagement. However, the immense political leverage held by Richard's queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and the loyalty of his English administration eventually forced the emperor's hand. Eleanor, acting with formidable energy and diplomatic skill, mobilized the resources of the entire Angevin Empire. She oversaw the collection of the exorbitant ransom, a sum of 150,000 marks, equivalent to twice the annual revenue of the English crown, through a combination of crippling taxes, seizures of church plate, and forced contributions. The ransom was a staggering financial burden, severely depleting the resources Richard had fought so hard to conserve in the Levant. In February 1194, after more than 14 months of brutal captivity, the ransom was finally paid, and Emperor Henry VI released Richard I. Emperor Henry VI, having secured the immense payment, rejected Philip's final desperate attempt to purchase Richard's continued detainment. Richard's first act upon liberation was not a return to the Crusader cause, but a furious, immediate journey back to England, where he quickly suppressed the residual rebellion led by his brother, Prince John, who was ultimately pardoned
but stripped of his power. The true reckoning for the Third Crusade now played out on the battlefields of continental Europe. Richard's focus shifted entirely to punishing Philip II for his cynical violation of the Gisors Oath. The war that followed was characterized by intense, small-scale sieges and battles fought primarily for territorial control of Normandy and the Vexin. Richard, now a king hardened by the desert and galvanized by betrayal, displayed his tactical genius by building the formidable Chateau Gaillard, a masterpiece of defensive engineering designed to lock Philip out of Normandy permanently. The conflict between the two monarchs became a grueling, highly personal war of attrition, lasting for 5 years. Richard, fueled by vengeance and possessing superior military skill, gradually regained most of the territories Philip had seized during his captivity. However, this period of conflict cemented the long-term geopolitical disaster of the Third Crusade. The vast expense incurred in the Holy Land and the crippling ransom drained the treasuries of England and France, yet the ultimate outcome was a mere return to the pre-Crusade antagonism. The spiritual aims of the Crusade had been subsumed entirely by the secular ambitions of the European kings. The final curtain fell on Richard's life, not in glorious battle against the infidel, but in a skirmish over a petty treasure hoard at the siege of Chaillot in 1199. He was struck by a crossbow bolt and succumbed to gangrene. Richard's death marked the end of the Angevin high point and the decisive turning point in the Anglo-French conflict. The subsequent ascension of the unreliable Prince John to the English throne provided Philip II with the final decisive opportunity he had long sought. Over the next decade, utilizing the territorial foundation he had laid during Richard's absence and exploiting John's military incompetence, Philip methodically captured Normandy, Anjou, and most of the remaining Plantagenet holdings in France. The Angevin Empire, created by Henry II, was effectively destroyed by the betrayal and political opportunism that originated in the strategic failures of the Third Crusade. Thus, the legacy of the 3 cruelest kings was settled. Frederick Barbarossa was claimed by geographical fate. Richard I, the Lionheart, achieved immortal glory, but was destroyed by the political consequences of his absence. And Philip II, the quiet viper, fulfilled his singular, calculating ambition. Jerusalem remained under the dominion of the successors of Saladin, but the true prize, the fragmentation of England's continental power, was secured by the King of France, confirming that in the age of the Crusades, political cruelty and strategic patience were ultimately more potent forces than martial heroism.
The story of the cruelest kings found its true conclusion not on the dust-choked plains of the Levant, nor in the muddy fields of Normandy, but in the halls of statecraft in Paris, a century after Richard I's death. The political ambition that defined Philip II's life, the systematic consolidation of the Capetian state, was brought to its chilling fulfillment by his grandson, Philip IV, known to history as the Fair for his idealized appearance, but feared as the Iron King for his implacable will. By the early 14th century, the geopolitical landscape had been entirely transformed by the legacy of the Third Crusade. The Angevin Empire was shattered, its French territories largely absorbed by the French crown, validating Philip II's strategy of patient betrayal. Jerusalem was a distant, lost cause, and the Crusader spirit was functionally dead, replaced by a ruthless, bureaucratic French nationalism dedicated to the supremacy of the crown. Philip IV was the ultimate product of this new reality. Unlike Richard, he was no warrior. Unlike Frederick, he claimed no divine mission to lead all of Christendom. He was a master administrator, a specialist in finance, law, and the centralization of power. His cruelty was neither the impulsive rage of a great fighter nor the strategic necessity of a general, but the icy, abstract cruelty of the state itself, dedicated only to its own financial and political survival. His final, definitive act, the true final cruelty of this dynastic saga, was directed not at a rival king, but at a vestige of the very ideal that had launched the Crusades, the Knights Templar. The Templars, the oldest and most powerful of the military orders, held immense wealth, acquired over centuries of service in the Holy Land, and operated as a tax-exempt international bank beholden only to the Pope. Within France, this wealthy, autonomous entity was a political affront and, crucially, a financial temptation. Philip IV, desperate for funds following expensive wars with Flanders, determined that the wealth of the Templars must be seized. His plan was executed with breathtaking speed and shocking modern-level coordination. On Friday, October 13, 1307, agents of the crown simultaneously arrested every known Templar in France. The subsequent proceedings were a grotesque parody of justice. Under torture sanctioned and directed by the king's ministers, the Templars were forced to confess to heresy, blasphemy, and illicit rites. The purpose of this torture was not conversion or even justice, but the legal rationalization for the state's financial plunder. By condemning them as heretics, Philip gained the moral and legal right to confiscate all their assets, the wealth that had flowed through Europe for 2 centuries in service of the Crusader ideal. The destruction culminated in 1314 with the execution of the Templar Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, who was burned at the stake in Paris. As he died, legend holds that he cursed the king and the Pope who had betrayed him, summoning them to meet him before God within a year. Both Philip IV and Pope Clement V died shortly thereafter, a dramatic flourish that sealed the narrative of divine retribution. The legacy of the Templar destruction was profound. It proved that the French monarchy, born out of the regional feuds of the 12th century, had become a centralized, absolute power capable of crushing any internal rival, even one sanctified by the Church and history for financial and political gain. The Crusader ideal, which had once compelled kings to beggar themselves for a distant city, was now cynically manipulated by the state to destroy its own agents and seize its wealth. The Capetian triumph was complete. The rivalry between Philip II and Richard I led to the Lionheart's physical demise and the fragmentation of his empire. Philip IV simply harvested the rewards, demonstrating that the true destiny of the medieval world lay not in the glory of Jerusalem, but in the cold, ruthless, enduring power of the modern European state. The final cruelty was the ultimate betrayal of the cross by the very kings who had once sworn to defend it.